Ambassador Bhumibol, Dr. Pitsuwan, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Hague Institute. We're very pleased to host the lecture this morning together with the Royal Thai Embassy, a valued friend and supporter of the Institute. Today we have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Surin Pitsuwan, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Thailand and former Secretary-General of ASEAN. An esteemed academic and statesman, Dr. Pitsuwan is well placed to enlighten us on the sufficiency economy philosophy, which underpins the Thai approach to development. In his remarks, he will pay particular attention to how this philosophy facilitates sustainable development and global justice. His reflections could not be more timely, with the UN General Assembly adopting the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development just last month, and the UN Climate Change Conference due to take place in Paris later this year. Sustainable development and global justice are an integral part of the forward-leaning research and policy agenda of the Hague Institute, and implemented through our three programs: conflict prevention, rule of law, and global governance. The conflict prevention program, for example, runs a project on water diplomacy, which seeks to identify and operationalize the key factors that contribute to the transformation of water conflicts into cooperation over water. The Rule of Law program has conducted numerous trainings for legal professionals and others who work in the justice sector in conflict-affected and post-conflict societies in order to build their capacities and improve access to justice. As part of its work under the Global Governance program, the Institute recently launched the final report of the Commission on Global Security, Justice and Governance, entitled Confronting the Crisis of Global Governance. The report presents recommendations for addressing a broad range of global challenges, from state fragility to climate change. I have no doubt that Dr. Pitsuwan's elaboration of the sufficiency economy philosophy will bring a fascinating, fresh perspective to our work here at the Institute and stimulates the thinking of all of us gathered here today. Following Dr. Pitsuwan's lecture, Dr. Richard Ponzio, head of the Global Governance program at the Institute, will provide a response to the lecture. I would now like to invite Ambassador Bhumibol to introduce our speaker today. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank Dr. A.B. Williams, President of the Hague Institute for Global Justice, for hosting today's event and for his warm words of welcome. I pay tribute to him and his colleagues at the Institute, especially Dr. Richard Ponzio, for the cooperative and collegial spirit that they bring to our partnership. Today's event is also supported by the Thailand Sustainable Development Foundation, which is the main organization in Thailand to promote balanced and sustainable development, including the application of the sufficiency economy philosophy. My name is once again Ithipon Bunprakong, Ambassador of the Kingdom of Thailand to the Kingdom of the Netherlands. It is a great pleasure for me to be here and an honor to address this gathering, welcoming Dr. Surin Pitsuwan, Chairman of Future Innovative Thailand Institute, who will address us on the sufficiency economy philosophy. and its contribution to the post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda. Dr. Surin is probably known by most of you as former Secretary-General, one of the most respected in the history of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. Dr. Surin's time at ASEAN from 2008 to 2012 saw the rise of ASEAN into an important global player in international affairs. He has guided the association through challenging times, including the opening up of Myanmar, the United States' entry into the East Asia Summit, and the rising tensions within the East Asian region, and at the same time laid a solid groundwork for an ASEAN-centered regional integration, including establishment of ASEAN Community in 2015. His portfolio includes Minister of Foreign Affairs of Thailand during 1997 to 2001, as well as extensive experiences at international organizations on issues such as development, globalization, and human security. He was a member of the Commission on Human Security of the United Nations between 2001 and 2003, and concurrently served on the World Commission on the Social Dimension of Globalization of the International Labour Organization until the year 2004. Ladies and gentlemen, about 3 weeks ago, after more than 3 years of intense negotiations, the world has finally agreed on the ambitious and transformative 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. As difficult as the 3 years of tough negotiations have proven, the truly hard part now lies before us. We, the government, civil society, academia, the private sector, the scientific community, and citizens around the world must translate the bold promise of this historic consensus into better lives of people everywhere. In pursuit of realization of those goals, Dr. Surin Pitsuwan, our keynote speaker, will share with you today on the contribution that sufficiency economy philosophy has made and can continue to bring to addressing global development challenges. Ever since the concept of sufficiency economy was first presented by His Majesty King Bhumibol in his birthday address on the 4th of December 1997, it has received growing attention by economists, development specialists, as well as international institutions who have recognized its contribution to the development discourse. And indeed, in May 2006, the former Secretary-General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, awarded to His Majesty King Bhumibol of Thailand the United Nations Development Programme's first Human Development Lifetime Achievement Award for His Majesty Visionary Sufficiency Economy Philosophy, which reinforces the United Nations efforts to promote a people-centered and sustainable path of development, and is of great relevance worldwide during this time of rapid globalization. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Surin Pitsuwan.
Very much. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Ambassador. And I would like to also express my appreciation to Dr. Williams and later on Dr. Poncho for joining us in this brief presentation of Thailand's effort, Thailand's initiative in our long journey to make sure that our development efforts and strategies are not going to have a negative impact on the global environment, on our own national environment, and certainly not diminishing the value of our own resources from the future generations. I'm particularly glad to walk into this building knowing that Mr. Van Essen, the mayor of the city, is essentially the main inspiration behind this institute. I am doubly honored to know that Madeleine Albright also is the chair of the governing board of this institute. We serve at the same time as foreign ministers, Mr. Van Essen, Madame Albright, myself, and a few others. And the group is still hanging together. Most of us are men, so we call ourselves Madeleine Albright's exes. We meet at least once a year, talking about global governance, talking about the fact that I think she must have used this phrase at this particular podium before. The world has become so multipolar, but there is no multilateral system to support it. I think that's the challenge of our global community today. And the Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development, coming from the UN, a few weeks ago, is a collection of global common awareness that we need a new direction for global development. First of all, we don't have enough for all the mouths that we have. 7 billion of us today, and by the year 2050, 2 billion more. There will be 9 billion human beings on the surface of this earth 35 years from now. Everything is not as finite as we thought it was way back when we began our industrialization, our development process all over the world. Now literally I think the world is running out of gas. We don't have enough, certainly don't have enough to waste, don't have enough just to pillage in every direction, in everything that we do. Thailand was on the road of that development, industrialization, globalization for a long, long time in the 80s into the 90s. That was a model of growth without much thinking, much attention being paid to what's going to happen to this little planet. We were growing 8, 9, 10, 11% a year into the 90s. 1997, the system broke down. Thailand was the origin of the place where the financial crisis of Asia occurred, 2nd of July, 1997. Banks fail, financial institutions fail, corporations fail, people lost jobs, many factories had to close up. A lot of unemployment, a lot of suffering. That was when His Majesty the King reached down to Thailand's heritage, Thailand's ethical depth, and he came up with this thing called sufficiency economy. It means you are not going to consume as much as you did when you think everything was available forever. It means you have to do everything with prudence. It means you're not going to get into debt beyond your means. It means you are not going to just paying no attention to the sensitivity, to the environment that is extremely fragile around you. You are not going to take away the future from your own posterity. You have to build your own immunity against any untoward economic downturn, which is very, very possible. In 1997, IMF came into Thailand and said, you have to follow this very bitter prescription. You have to maintain your budget surplus, you have to maintain high interest rate, you have to let every bank, every financial institution, every corporation fail. They have to submit to the logic of the market. Well, 2008 came, Europe went through the same thing, North America went through the same thing, but many of your governments said there are corporations that are too big to fail. The prescription was very different from what we were given back in 1997. But we submitted to that prescription. We followed the prescription, and we institute new governance into our corporations, our banks, our financial institutions. We re-emerged. By the year 2003, we were performing better than we did before the crisis of 1997. I think that's explained why East Asia is still holding itself now, in spite of what you had gone through here in Europe and North America, our traditional markets. Because we have transformed, we have instituted new governance, we have become more transparent, more disciplined in the running of our economies. But yet, the consumption pattern that used to be the engine of growth in the past has come back. That people won't want to consume more, people want to spend more, people want to enjoy the luxuries as they did. This philosophy came into being to caution the people in Thailand and certainly in Southeast Asia that, look, we need an alternative way forward into the future. It is, like Mr. Williams said, timely in a sense that the global community is looking for the same answer. From the Rio agenda, taking care of the environment, to the financing for development, to the Rio Plus, paying more attention to the environment, to now the Global Agenda 2030, sustainable development. We have to assume that behind that philosophy of sustainable development, there is this global awareness rising in every corner of the world. That the younger generation are now asking, maybe the path of our older generations have not been entirely correct. We need to change the direction, we need to shift the emphasis. Here in the Netherlands, I understand one of your former prime ministers, Jan-Peter Balkenende. Is that how you pronounce his name? He was the prime minister between 2002 and 2010. I met him in the Great Hall of the People of China in Beijing during the ASEAN Summit Asia-Europe meeting. Europeans were worried about your own economy under fire at that time, October 2008. All leaders of Europe were there in the Great Hall of the People of China, seat of the Communist Party. Barroso was there, Berlusconi was there, Sarkozy was there, Mr. Balkenende was there. What's her name in Germany? She's still here. Merkel was there. And they were asking the same thing from China and from East Asia. And that was, please keep consuming. Please keep importing. Please keep buying our products and our services. So much so that the Foreign Secretary of the UK pulled me aside and said, Mr. Secretary-General, I was my first year at ASEAN. This meeting is a very strange meeting indeed. I said, how so? He said, we from the West, open market capitalists, are now asking the Chinese in the Great Hall of the People, the seat of the Communist Party, for help. That was when I realized that the pendulum is swinging back to East Asia, where the center of gravity is now, where the consumption is now, where the industrialization is going on now, where development is going on on a very, very fast pace. So the concern now is how East Asia is going to manage its own development agenda. Because they consume more there, they spend more there, they exploit resources more there, they are all over the world trying to make sure that they will have these raw materials into the future. So there's a debate. From the West, restrain, slow down, don't follow our mistakes. We have had a few hundred years of industrialization and development. You are just beginning. Don't follow our mistake. Slow down. And the Chinese are saying, well, you have had your share. You have had your development. You have had your prosperity, your luxury. The Indians are saying the same thing. The Brazilians are saying the same thing. The Mexicans are saying the same thing. That you have had your chance. Now it is our chance. But that's where the problem is. All of us cannot be East nor West. It will have to be the global community as a whole, looking into the issue of development, mindless development, development without caring of any destruction to the environment or to the future. So the initiative here, I'll use it as an example, by the former Prime Minister Balkenende, coalition of Dutch Sustainable Coalition, Development Growth Coalition. This is an initiative from the side of the private sector, of the corporate sector. Because the private sector, the corporate sector, have been at the forefront of development, of using up the environment, of using up the resources, of economic growth fast, with full consumption. Sufficiency economy came from another level. Let us look at the way people live. Let us look at the way people have their own living. Poor people in many places, particularly tropical areas, will have to live with the forest. And the forest is where the source of all the waters coming down the plain, where they irrigate the agriculture. When they move, when they burn, when they trash, when they move away, they are destroying the resources that would keep the lowland arable. How to manage that? This is sustainable too. This is destruction of the environment too. This is overconsumption too. So sufficiency economy came into being. Let us take care of those underprivileged, marginalized, and poor, who have no other choices except using the environment. When you talk about global justice, Mr. Williams, you talk about fair distribution of opportunities and fair distribution of resources and fair distribution of the consumption of those resources. That's why the Agenda 2030 is not only talking about the careful use of natural resources, but we have to tackle the issue of poverty. We have to tackle the issue of inequity. We have to tackle the issue of poor people, no other alternatives except living off the environment. Unless and until we can address their problems, there won't be any sustainability, there won't be any fairness, there won't be any global justice. We are talking about 9 billion people by the year 2050, 35 years from now. Unless and until we can also resolve the issue of poverty, there won't be equity, there won't be sustainability. So, how did we do it with the poor, with the, what you call, thrash and burn farmers? When the soil depletes its nutrients, they have to move away from the top of that mountain to the next mountain. They have to cut down the forest. They have to destroy the watershed. A lot of them migrated to the urban area. A lot of them went into Bangkok, into the factories, and to drive taxis. And a lot of these people got into debt further. A lot of these people got into gambling. A lot of these people got into alcoholism because no education, because they have no other recourse to life. And they couldn't send anything out back to the villages because they are themselves in debt. These people, hundreds and thousands and close to a million of them in urban areas, and their families back home, could not sustain their livelihood. Therefore, ergo, the destruction of the environment. Those are the people that sufficiency economy would come in and say, you survive first. You have to survive. So you go back to your farms and live within your means, and we'll provide irrigation, we'll provide seedlings, we will make sure that you have the necessities in order to be productive on your own land, your families and yourself. Get out of debt, get out of alcoholism, get out of overconsumption and gambling. So they survive at that level. After survival, we have to help them to be sufficient. In other words, within the limited piece of land that they have to survive. Sufficiency economy says, don't plant just one crop, but divide your land into areas where you can raise animals, where you can grow rice, where you can grow fruits and vegetables, where you can live and where you can raise fish or frogs for your own sustainable, for your own survival. After that, we can talk about their participation in the larger national sustainable development. There's a criticism that maybe this philosophy, this approach is to keep them there, not to be able to get any further. But we are now finding out that corporations and young professionals in the cities who came from those distant provinces around the country are beginning to change their lifestyle, adopting this philosophy of sufficiency economy. Doctors, engineers, architects who used to live in Bangkok and in major cities, who used to make millions, are now willing to make less than $1 million, but go back to the provinces and try to live according to this philosophy and help their own people from the urban area, small urban area of those provincial capitals. rather than making unlimited amount, particularly with the opening up of the region, ASEAN Economic Community. Doctors, nurses, accountants, architects, engineers can move around the landscape. They can make a lot of money. But they are now people, professional, qualified, with great future, but who are turning around and saying, I would rather go back and live back home within the means and trying to help people in my village, in my province, in my community. That's the trend that we are seeing. And also, the sons and the daughters of these people who live with this sufficiency economy are now coming out of the educational system and becoming professionals themselves. The idea is not just to keep them there. The idea is for them first to survive, for them first to be sufficient, so that together we can contribute into this sustainable effort globally. Nobody can do it alone. Each level of economic development will have to find its own way for sustainability. Each of the 16, not 17, because 17 says, let us improve on the way. I'm talking about the Agenda 2030. Agenda 17 means let's improve the way of implementing these 16 targets. But of the 16, we will have to look into which one that each and every one of us, every sector, every level of economic development. And I'm using this example of Prime Minister Balkenende as an example that maybe for the Netherlands, this is where it has to start. The corporate sector of the Netherlands will have to think about sustainability in their own way. What they're going to produce, what technology they're going to put in, what saving they can do, and what less consumption of the resources that they can do. I understand Philips is going into new business of producing light bulbs that would help plants grow, that would help new form of agriculture, more productive, more yield. I mean, with the technology that you have, you can do that. But with our level of development, we go for the least fortunate people who are also destroying the planet. Out of necessity, from their own perspective, they have to survive. The equity maybe in the system is not good enough for them to survive from the growth that we have been accumulating in the past. They are still at that level. They have no other means, no other choice. For them, justice means access to natural resources. No means, no other technology, meaning do whatever you have to in order to survive. If you have to cut down the forest, if you have to cut down the trees, you have to. So global justice, Director Williams, for each and individual of the 7 billion that we have now on Earth means differently. At different station in life, in different perspective, in different position that you have, in different profession that you have. But one thing in common is equity. That is, you have yours, I have mine. We are fairly distributed. I have my responsibility, you have your responsibility. I have my opportunity, you have your opportunity. The cost of inequity, Stiglitz would say, is too enormous for the global community. Sufficiency economy is an address into that inequitable management of our development, of our growth, which will contribute to a fairer world. That's the final objective of all these efforts. There are many other approaches, other attempts around the world. In Bhutan, it is called gross national happiness, not gross national product. But Bhutan is a small country, mostly agricultural, mostly hilly. When you try to define your own road to sustainability, you only look at your what already exists on the ground. Thailand has gone very far in industrialization. Growth has been achieved, but equity is not there. The quality of that growth is not there. This is one way of addressing that deficit of equity, deficit of equal opportunity, deficit of fair distribution of the fruits of growth that we have had in the past. So we need to create a real coalition of the willing, a real coalition of goodwill, a real and effective coalition of commitment, that each and every individual is both a cause and a resolution to the problems that we are facing as a global community. 65 million years ago, life forms on Earth were all wiped out because of that natural catastrophe. When we are told a meteorite, big one, hit the Earth and kicked up cloud dust to cover our atmosphere. All life forms perished, including the dinosaur. We were not here yet. We are not responsible for that catastrophe. Something is looming. And I hope the Institute is also looking into this. Something is looming in the future. Science is telling us that the next catastrophe, climate change, global warming, is occurring because of each and every one of us. We are the authors of our own catastrophe in the future. We are possible author of our own extinction as a species. If that is not alarming, I don't know what is. If that is not what the assumption behind the 16, 17 targets in the global, in the Agenda 2030 agenda, I don't know what else. What we need now is that global awareness, is that global consciousness that the ownership of this little village is all of us, belongs to all of us, and we have to take care of it. The last time I looked, we have no other alternative planet to move to. We are preparing for a future short of that catastrophe. Sufficiency economy is a contribution to that effort. Sufficiency economy is saying, use your intelligence, use your prudence, make sure you have resiliency, immunity against any downturn of the economic system. Be careful with your environment and look around where there are people who are pursuing the same thing. Join hands and work with them because the objective is the same. And that objective is each and every one of us must make a contribution. No man is an island. No woman either. No man is an island, no woman is an island, entire of itself, standing alone, not depending on anyone. No man is an island, entire of itself. Any man's death, any man's suffering, any child's hunger, any woman's pain diminishes me and every one of us because I am involved in mankind. That's where the coalition of the willing, the real coalition of the able, will have to come into being, because we have to work together. Sufficient economy is just like what John Donne said, no man is an island entire of itself. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, Europe or Asia. So send not to us for whom the bell of sustainability tolls. It tolls for thee and every one of us. And I hope by this introduction of sufficiency economy, we can open a more lively debate into the future. Look further where efforts are being made. According to that agreement in New York 3 weeks ago, Europe would go one way, the Netherlands would go one way, but contributing to the same thing, traveling on the same road, and that road of sustainability, of survivability of the human species and all other species who also legitimately claim ownership of this planet, just like us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pitsuwan. On behalf of my colleagues here at the Hague Institute for Global Justice, let me also welcome you, and as well as your colleagues from the Royal Thai Embassy, and all of our participants to this presentation and dialogue on the sufficiency economy philosophy contributing to the post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda. Having admired Dr. Pitsuwan's impressive writings and tenure as both ASEAN Secretary-General and his government's foreign minister, it is indeed a privilege to share a few comments in response to your thought-provoking presentation today, as well as to pose a few specific questions to probe a little further on some of the fundamental themes at the heart of our discussion this morning. Given the unveiling just last month of the post-2015 Development Agenda and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals by world leaders gathering at UN headquarters in New York, it is highly auspicious timing, too, for a dialogue on His Majesty Bhumibol's Sufficiency Economy Philosophy, or SEP approach, here in the international city of peace and justice, which we're proud to note is the only other city to host one of the 6 primary organs of the United Nations, of course, the Peace Palace, the International Court of Justice. I have grouped my brief comments and questions in 3 categories. First, I consider some of the major features of the SEP approach and how it contributes to both national and individual participation in the globalized economy. Secondly, how this innovative philosophy relates to the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, what, if anything, this philosophy can mean for regional approaches to governance and economic cooperation, building on your notable successes ahead of ASEAN Regional Forum, of the ASEAN. So with regards to my first category, Dr. Pitsuwan has ably demonstrated the SEP approach's contribution in the aftermath of the late 1990s Asian financial crisis, as well as in today's increasingly globalized world, by empowering Thailand as a country, but also its citizens, especially as he, I quote, underprivileged, the marginalized, and the poor, and the need to tackle in particular these key concepts of inequality and poverty reduction. By offering specific tools and a positive culture to compete and prosper in today's increasingly interdependent, technologically interconnected, and fast-paced global economy. So in addition to some of the core principles, as well as the conditions for the philosophy that Dr. Pitsuwan outlined, when considering this approach's application at the project and community level, I found that his adoption of a holistic development perspective was particularly helpful. Here he emphasized first survival, followed years later by sufficiency itself, but then the critical phase is succeeded by this period of sustainability. This typology offers concrete indicators that will enable project managers as well as leaders at various levels of governance to assess their progress and determine for a target population and communities whether they're on a path towards higher levels of development. One of the examples in his writings on this is that the initial survival period, in the initial survival period, debts may remain within a community or individual where they may be entirely or partly repaid, but in this sufficiency phase. But meanwhile, in reaching the more advanced sustainability phase, a level of savings is achieved that allows for investments in both individual professional development and new entrepreneurial enterprises. On the concept of sustainability, of course, Dr. Pitsuwan also stressed preservation of the environment and conservation of our precious natural resources. So in short, projects in Thailand, in the country of Thailand, where Dr. Pitsuwan is from, have inspired this pattern of holistic development, and it's shown to progress from basic needs, such as freedom from poverty and access to food, to better education and fostering entrepreneurship. For me, this harkens back to the concept of human security, which Dr. Pitsuwan knows quite well, and human development, both developed by South Asian economists Amartya Sen and Dr. Bhumibol and their collaborators over the past 2 decades. And they stressed in their writings the need to get basic essentials right, such as targeted investments in education, healthcare, women and children, followed by getting the state out of industries where it is inefficient while creating an enabling environment for farmers and private businesses to grow, expand cross-border commercial opportunities, and thrive over time. So a first question for Dr. Pitsuwan is, how would you frame the relationship between these concepts of human security and human development with the sufficiency economy philosophy? And to which extent would you perhaps argue that the SCP approach, in fact, both enriches and extends beyond human security and human development? And he also highlighted the related concept of gross national happiness. My second category of comment deals with how the SCP's innovative philosophy relates to and indeed can strengthen the focus and implementation of the recently unveiled post-2015 development agenda. These goals introduced last month will undoubtedly be the touchstone for global development policy for the foreseeable future. They apply to all countries and should therefore be underpinned by a truly global normative framework. That is, that they should represent a global consensus of the heart, not just the mind, as Dr. Pitsuwan has written elsewhere. And they should not represent an imposition of another region's values. In your assessment, Dr. Pitsuwan, do the recently adopted SDGs represent such a genuine global consensus? And more particularly, can sufficiency economy philosophy be used as an interpretive lens through which to view some or all of the 17 SDGs, providing in a sense a non-Western and intellectual antecedent to this new global development agenda? And have there been efforts by Thailand to export variations of the SCP approach to both nearby or even distant countries seeking to strengthen their economies, create jobs, and now, in fact, to advance the goals and targets associated with the 2030 agenda? You also stressed the involvement of the business community, how it's viewed as imperative for sufficiency economy philosophy and the fulfillment of the SDGs alike. We're pleased that you also highlighted former Dutch Prime Minister Balkenende's Sustainable Growth Coalition, led by the private sector. Could lessons be learned then from Thailand and applied at the global level for engaging the private sector better in pursuing the Sustainable Development Goals? A point that is, of course, underscored in the concluding 17th Sustainable Development Goal that you highlighted on revitalizing the global partnership for sustainable development. And what could existing UN initiatives, such as the Global Compact, which engages the private sector in the UN's agenda, learn from the SCP approach? My final set of comments and questions center around what the sufficiency economy philosophy can potentially mean for regional approaches to governance and economic cooperation, building on ASEAN's notable progress in Southeast Asia. As I stated earlier, Dr. Pitsuwan mentioned that the SCP approach can apply at the individual, community, and national levels, especially drawing on your experience as the former Secretary-General of ASEAN. Would you see any potential for applying the SCP approach on a regional level? In this light, how would you assess the progress ASEAN has made in terms of economic integration, seeing that this year, in a month's time, we'll be welcoming in the ASEAN Economic Community? Will this be a sustainable economic community, in your opinion? I'm also pleased to share, as was highlighted by Dr. Williams in his opening remarks, the recent report of the Commission on Global Security, Justice, and Governance. As you know, it was co-chaired by former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, your friend, from the ASEAN Ministerial Forum, as well as former Nigerian Foreign Minister and UN Under-Secretary-General Dr. Ibrahim Gambari. And this was supported by our institute and our partners in Washington, the Stimson Center. It offers strong support for the role of regional organizations such as ASEAN in confronting some of today's most pressing global governance challenges in ways that I believe are consistent with the sustainable economy philosophy approach. It calls, for example, for a dialogue on policy priorities between the Group of 20, or G20 Forum, and regional organizations, including ASEAN, on issues related to cross-border economic shocks and adopting integrated approaches across economic, social, and environmental areas in the international system. It recommends that regional trading agreements, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now under review in regional capitals in the Asia-Pacific region, adopt measures consistent with curbing the release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and favorable for population adaptation to the effects of climate change. The Commission further calls on regional organizations to bolster international human rights measures through regional measures. And here, the Southeast Asian region can build on its initial progress through the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, established in 2009. This past June, in fact, we hosted a meeting here at the Hague Institute on ASEAN and global governance, economic community, and the wider regional architecture. It grappled with many of these regional issues related to sufficiency, economy, philosophy, and besides scholars, we're very pleased that it included representatives from all 10 ASEAN member countries. So one final question I have for Dr. Pitsuwan in this area, since it's so topical and relevant in with today's overall theme, that is, what does the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, mean for the ASEAN region and for the SCP approach in particular? Can we expect other ASEAN members beyond Singapore, Brunei, Malaysia, and Vietnam to someday join the TPP? So since, in addition to my commentary, I raised a whole bunch of questions, I certainly don't expect you, and please do not feel obliged to tackle all or even many of these questions, but I was hoping that they would help to provoke further critical thinking and discussion on how far indeed the Thai King's sufficiency economy philosophy has come in recent years, with an eye now to the future and how this approach can be employed by many countries in the international community to advance the Sustainable Goals agenda. So thank you once again for your very thoughtful and stimulating remarks, and I now look forward to hearing from our esteemed audience. Thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wide-ranging and very perceptive comments. And I'm sure our audience would like to engage with you. But first, let me take the prerogative as the moderator to start with a few questions. And the first question turns around values. You underline the importance of sustainable development. And my question is, what are the values which should underpin sustainable development? And are those values universal, as many in the West would claim, or are those values relative, as we're seeing many people in Asia arguing about the relativity of values? So, and the values, what are the values which should underpin sustainable development? Are they universal or are they relative? And how do we bridge the gap between the two perceptions?
Thank you. That's a difficult question.
You're used to difficult questions.
Yes. I think we are talking here in the sufficiency economy approach or sustainability approach to development. We are talking about basic human values. We are talking about how to survive the calamity that inevitably a society has to go through once in a while. We are talking about fairness in our community, in our society. We are talking about dignity, human freedom, human dignity. These are basic human values. And I think each and every one of us across culture would have to agree that these things are ingredients for being a good human being, for leading a good life. But the differences occurred when specific structure of society, of governance, is being instituted in order to prioritize the problems that those societies are facing. Some countries have to emphasize on law and order first before they have to survive first, they have to have enough to eat first, they have to have security first. So they emphasize on that, and they said the rest can wait. The perspective of the West is, no, we start with fundamental freedom. We start with personal space in order to allow each and every human being to grow, to develop to his or her full potentiality. And along the way, you build the structure to govern and to run the societies. But I think if you look through the history, we have traveled through similar journey. Here in the West, I think history would tell us that there are a lot of problems on issues of norms, issue of values. There used to be tremendous violence and wars among countries, among tribes. I was at Oxford last year for the whole year, and there's a place in the middle of the Oxford Square commemorating the burning of 3 priests who happened to be anti-Rome, and the punishment was burning to death. And in the middle of this Oxford main road, there are 3 spots. These were spots where priests of Oxford gave their life in order to testify to their faith, loyalty to God, not to Rome. So you have gone through tremendous turmoil in your history, religious war, all the problems that you have gone through. Once came the Age of Enlightenment, once came the industrialization, once came the age of democracy. Things change and move on a different path. Some other parts of the world were not following, or at least not in the same rhythm. So they have different ways, different perspectives. But if you are alluding to the idea of the Asian values and Western values, I think the Asian values are now incrementally moving toward more universal. Not West, but universal. Ergo, the Intergovernment Commission of Human Rights, the Intergovernment Commission of the Rights of the Woman and the Children and the Child. These are, I think, the continuous conversation among cultures, between cultures and different parts of the world. I tend to agree with Professor Amartya Sen, who said there's no such thing as the clash of civilizations. In history, there's always been the accommodation of culture, that we learn from each other, and we learn the mistakes of each other, and we learn to emulate the success of each other to move into the future. Now, sufficiency economy is based on the fact that every human being needs to survive. Every human being needs to maintain his or her dignity. Every human being needs to protect and provide for his or her own family and children. When you start with that basic assumption, you come up with a system of thought, you can call it an ideology to sustain the objectives, to achieve the goals of your society. sufficiency economy is one such thing for Thailand at this moment in time, with a lot of problems, having gone through many, many challenges, but this is a way forward. So we won't have to go back to that destructive path of development as we did in the past, with a lot of suffering were experienced by our people.
You observed at the outset of your lecture that we live in a multipolar world, but we lack a multilateral system. Given that the governance challenges that we face are increasingly global in nature, how do you see the international community addressing those challenges in the absence of the multilateral system? And specifically, what role can regional organizations then play?
I think that's what the discussant, Mr. Poncho, said earlier on, and that is regional organizations have been created to manage the problems and the challenges common to them in the region. And they understand the sentiments of each other, they understand the sensitivities and the limitations of cooperation in their own region. I can give you an example of how ASEAN dealt with Myanmar. When the West wanted to sanction Myanmar totally, when ASEAN admitted Myanmar in 1997, the year of the crisis, I was what you call the country coordinator. Thailand was country coordinator with the European Union, how to work with ASEAN. And I had to negotiate with foreign ministers in Europe of how to get the dialogue on track, even with Myanmar on board. I remember with Mr. Van Nessen, I said, okay, Myanmar is going to be the group, we can't do anything about that, it's already a member, but there won't be any name in front of Myanmar's representative, there won't be any flag, would you agree to that? He said he'll have to go through Mr. Van Nessen. He said he would have to agree to discuss with his friends. And then I proposed no flag, no names, but new members of ASEAN, Laos and Myanmar. Would that be agreeable? In the end, yes, agreeable, but Myanmar cannot speak at the meeting. I said, leave that to me. I will talk to them, not impose from outside. They will be silent. In the end, we were able to get the panel back together, cooperation and coordination between the EU and ASEAN, only because we in the region understand the situation. Same as opening up Myanmar after long time of military dictatorship. In the end, now Myanmar is a member of an international community. But pressure, isolation, sanction, for us, are not the only answer. So the idea now is that for the global community to rely more on the regional organizations who are closer to the regions, understand the sensitivity and the sentiments of the members better than the UN itself. And the UN itself is also in need of some reform because the problems have gone beyond the system and the institution that was established right after the Second World War, the last global catastrophe, human-made, that we together went through. So more and more, I think this multilateral system will have to be a connection, a network of regional organizations working together. And more regional organizations are getting a lot of requests, a lot of expectation, a lot of demand from the global community. Do something, help deliver this, help answer this question, this challenge. And in some areas we fail, in some areas we succeed. I think that's normal, but more and more regional organizations will have to come to the fore and be responsible for problems in their part of the world, contributing to the global community as a whole.
Well, thank you very much. At this juncture, I'd like to bring in the audience Could you just, I think we have a roving mic, just give your name, institutional affiliation, and then do keep the questions as crisp and succinct as possible so we can get as many in as possible. And I'll take them in sets of 3s.
I'm a Lithuanian ambassador. Small European country, Lithuania. Ambassador of Lithuania. Well, actually, always they say the devil is in the details, well, it's really very intriguing to listen to basically this proposal to return back to subsistence farming, which sounds nice, but then there was a good point in the question on TPP and how to reconcile that farming on a small piece of land, primitive way, producing a very expensive product, and somehow it has to survive in the market where there's much cheaper product coming from somewhere else where it is produced efficiently in large scale farms. Is it still possible to preserve the market system? What mechanism do you employ to implement this philosophy, and what tools do you use to really encourage those people or force those people to get back to this subsistence farming, which here perhaps would lead to poverty in Europe?
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dr. Pitsuwan, my name is Khalid Ahmed Chaudhry, and I'm representing the International Human Rights Commission. So you made my day when you were talking about shift of pendulum. Allow me, please, to put a question over human rights conditions within the boundaries of Thailand and rule of law. If you are satisfied with that, thank you very much.
Yes, lady.
Thank you very much. My name is Yumiko. I am a postdoc researcher that has joined the Hague Institute and the Stockholm International Law Institute and Uppsala University in Sweden. And it was very interesting to hear about this sufficiency economy philosophy, and you also mentioned about the sort of impact of China. And I'm wondering whether you could mention a little bit about how could this kind of big economy like China, is there any role of regional organization to play to bring this kind of sufficiency economy philosophy into China, if you could?
Thank you.
Can I stand up?
Yes, of course.
With difficult questions, I have to stand up. The ambassador from Lithuania, let me clarify my point. It's not subsistent economy that we are talking about. It's for a particular group of people who need to survive initially. So, as I said, they are not going to be kept there forever. This is to solve the problems that they are facing at the moment: poverty, indebtedness, and of course, all the wrong things that they are involved in. When they have no hope, they turn to gambling. Government lottery is very, very popular in countries where there is poverty. In fact, the poor live on the hope of lottery. And there are government lotteries and there are non-government lotteries. There are a lot of gambling as happiness, as pastime. Very destructive to the soul, to the character, to self-confidence and self-respect. we have to admit that there are a lot of people around the world, particularly in the developing part of the world, who are wasting their lives and their opportunities at that level. We have to address the issue of overdevelopment without equitability in the system and without sharing and caring for these people who are languishing at the margin of the society or at the bottom of the societies. So it's not subsistent economy or farming, but again, sufficiency in a way that would help them to survive and later on help them to grow and later on help them to get out of that position in life. Where is the market mechanism? Market mechanism is still there. But for many, they don't produce for the market and they could not produce for the market yet. To survive first. When they have the surplus, they will join. Sufficiency economy is a set of norms and values that would help people survive in the system from the bottom all the way up. As I said, if you are an engineer, you can adopt sufficiency economy by living within your means, by not overconsumption, not going into debt, use intelligence, have some savings for rainy days in the future. So it runs across the strata of economic ladder of the society, like economic layers of the society. TPP, yes, I mean, ASEAN integrated market is coming into being. TPP had just been announced. There are 4 ASEAN members. Let me answer Mr. Poncho at the same time. 4 ASEAN members are joining TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, led by the US, led by Australia, led by Japan, Chile, and Peru, and the smaller countries in between, 12 of them. For ASEAN, coming up with our economic community at the end of next month, the other 6 will have to concentrate on more integration, improving upon the standards, improving upon their own transparency, their own efficiency, their own governance in order to measure up to what Mr. Obama called the 21st century trade agreement. There will be a lot of teething problems setting up the TPP because the different in the development stages of all those member states, we don't have to worry about Brunei because it's one commodity economy. It's welfare state anyway. We don't quite have to worry about Singapore because it's a small economy. It's a nation state. It's very efficient, very open already. We may have to worry about countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, because there are a lot of things in the TPP that these 2 countries, among others, will have difficulties delivering their commitments. Malaysia would be government procurement, government infrastructure investments. US companies want to come in, Japanese companies want to come in, Australian, New Zealand companies want to come in, definitely local corporations, local construction companies cannot compete. What do they have to do? That has been part of the system all along since independence. Government procurement is closed. Agriculture in Japan, health industry in Japan. These are the areas that are going to be difficult. This is answering Mr. Poncho. But so for ASEAN, the answer is more ASEAN, more integration, more improvement of the standards in order to measure up to the requirement of TPP. But the market has a role in sufficiency economy. Again, appropriate market. When you have surplus, you share, you trade. A lot of communities going into farming of products organic, without fertilizers, and healthy, and the market is there. And the market in Thailand is tourism market. The market is 20 million plus tourists coming in. They like to have these kind of products guaranteed. In fact, Royal initiated projects under His Majesty the King produce these things. Tropical fruits, strawberries. They don't grow on the lowland, but they grow in the hills. The hills where the people poor. The hills where people trash, the hills where the people grow opium. So the market is there for them at the level that they can manage. We have to protect them from being exploited, but they have produce and products that they can share, that they can sell, that they can trade into the market, but not multinational corporations as clients, not yet anyway. But some of them will find their way here. Organic plant, organic vegetable, organic fruits will find their ways into high value markets in the West, particularly in Europe, through your own system of retails and multinational corporations seeking out these products and produce quality around the world. So let me repeat, not subsistent farming as we had in the past, but sufficiency in the sense that it is on a continuous road out of poverty into a more effective and more equitable and fairer market system. And I think if we can manage that, we can claim that we make a contribution to, again, the larger goal of sustainability. Am I satisfied with the situation of human rights in Thailand? Thailand is going through its own search for a new balance. Unfortunately, again, the model of development in the past has not served the Thai people, 67 million, equitably and fair. In my opinion, when majority has been taken as license, I don't think that's a quality of democracy that we want. Because that's majoritarianism. That's taking majority and do everything you want, claiming that you have the legitimacy, you have the majority. You have the rule of law to respect. You have national cultures and traditions to respect. In functioning, older, mature democracies anywhere, Japan or here in the West, many of the practices were not prescribed by law, but they were practiced by tradition. We have not had that time to develop both the tradition and the sentiment of respect to the tradition. I personally would describe myself as Edmund Burkean conservative, meaning I believe that liberty and institutions and norms and traditions can coexist. In fact, traditions and norms and institutions can help nurturing and maintaining liberty. It is now a country breaking down in the form of governance. Democracy has been misused, abused, majority has been taken as license to do anything, but it has had a tremendous negative impact on the society. So now it's a time to do a lot of thinking, a lot of reflection, aiming at the same thing, maintaining human rights, maintaining liberty, maintaining law and order inside. It's a country at work trying to find its new balance. And I'm pretty sure we'll bounce back. 82 years of experiment with democracy, long before any other countries in the region, because other countries were colonies when Thailand began the experiment with democracy. But it has been a rugged road of democracy. We have to go through it. Europe has had hundreds of years to experiment. Many countries have had longer. Thailand is no exception. It needs a bit of time to go through its own democratic journey. And we need understanding, and we need support, we need sympathy from around the world for us to walk through. Again, the ambience, the governing ambience, the structure will be important to what we are talking about, contributing to that final global goal, sustainability, without full contribution and participation of the people, ergo democracy. It's going to be difficult to deliver many of these goals. But we do what we have to do within the limitation that we have. That's all. I hope I answered your questions. On the region, on China, well, you know, ASEAN is going into the community at the end of this year, later next month. ASEAN +6 are working on a larger economic and trading architecture called ASEAN Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. China, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, New Zealand, 6 are in this group with us, 10. And each country is now facing with the challenge of development, sustainable development. Signatories to this Agenda 2030 at the UN 3 weeks ago, each will have to find its gateway. And within ASEAN, we are doing our own exchange, our own deliberation of what kind of sustainable development we are going to pursue together. If you follow the news, Singapore, Malaysia, Southern Thailand, and Indonesia have been suffering from forest haze in the past several weeks. And it is worse than many, many years in the past because of the forest fire on the islands of Borneo or Kalimantan, Indonesia, Sumatra. And the situation is very, very serious because it's not fire on the surface, at the bottom of the trees, the dry leaves. The fire dived into underground, what they call peatland, P-E-T-E. This is a natural element, I think few 100 million years before they become coal. C-O-A-L, called peatland. That's where it is burning. It is extremely difficult. And when you want to exploit the forest, when you want to exploit the peatland, you have to also be able to manage the consequences and the impact. So East Asia, a small C community is evolving. A small C community is developing. I understand Mr. Kevin Rudd is coming here in the next few days. He once proposed the Asia-Pacific Community, Big C. And the countries in East Asia said, we are not quite ready with the Big C community. But a small C community is evolving. That small C community is now looking into areas in which we can cooperate to make sure that that community in East Asia will evolve into a sustainable community, not having to face the breakdown like East Asia in 1997. Oh, I don't know what will happen to China. It's also facing some pressure. hopefully they can manage, but it's a problem. So East Asia needs to think about that. East Asia is talking about sustainability within ourselves, among ourselves. One observation is what I began with this morning. East Asia is now the center of gravity. East Asia now is expected to be the engine of growth, pulling the rest of the global economy forward. So anything happens to East Asia will have more impact to the global community than 10, 20, 15 years ago. That's why the world is very much attentive to what is happening in East Asia. Are they burning their environment? Are they consuming beyond their means? Are they growing too far? Is the bubble being developed? What if it's burst? When it bursts, you suffer. When it bursts, North America suffers because you depend on East Asia as the engine of growth. So we are all connected. We are all interconnected. We are all living in a world that is no longer in isolation, no longer as islands entire of ourselves. That's the philosophy, that's the assumption, that's the basic assumption behind 2030 sustainable agenda. Because we are in it together. No one can deliver on his or her own. This sufficiency economy is one way, maybe small, but we are taking it seriously, 67 million of us, and sharing it with our neighbors. Let us move in the right direction so that we don't have to make the correction painful as we have had the experience when we failed last time around, 1997. First economic crisis of East Asia. Thank you.
Well, it remains for me to thank you very much, Dr. Pitsuwan, for being with us this morning, for your illuminating remarks, and of course for the openness with which you have addressed the questions. You mentioned in your formal remarks that it would be important for the Hague Institute to be engaged on climate change, and I wanted, of course, to reassure you that indeed we are. In fact, it is one of our priority projects in our conflict prevention program, because we recognize that many conflicts in the world have a dimension of climate change involved. So we're looking at it through that perspective. And of course, the Commission on Global Security, Justice and Governance, a copy of whose report you now have, also looked at climate change and came forward with practical recommendations to address it. In your response about taking the long view in terms of democratic development, you spoke like a real Burkean, as you said, because certainly Edmund Burke took that perspective when he reflected on the time which would be involved in the building of a nation. Because for Edmund Burke, as he said, the ends of such a partnership could not be attained in one generation, but it was a partnership between those who were living, those who were dead, and those who were yet to be born. So it was certainly in the Burkean tradition in which you spoke. So we thank you very much for being with us. We're also very grateful to the government of Thailand for its financial support which it has provided to this institute from the outset, and we're also particularly grateful for the close cooperation which we have with the Royal Thai Embassy here. So join me in thanking Dr. Pitsuwan.